Their solution was to kill Jesus Christ. Supposedly, in killing Christ, they would be able to save their nation. Jesus had become too controversial. He had questioned their teachings to a far greater extent that they wanted. They did not like his view of the Sabbath. And so they decided that they were going to get rid of him. And in this way, they would save their nation from falling apart and perishing. We're told in verse 53 of this same chapter 11 of John that the Sanhedrin at that moment, a few months before the death of Christ, pronounced the death sentence against this troublemaker. We're told there in John 11 and verse 53, then from that day on they plotted to put him to death, supposedly to save their nation from perishing. But they had a serious problem. And that is that as a religious institution, as a church, they could not carry out their purposes. They could not actually carry out the death sentence upon Christ, because the religious system was not authorized to execute a punishment such as that. And so as a church, their hands were tied, so to speak, in executing the death sentence that the Sanhedrin had pronounced against Jesus. And so they needed the help of the state. And so in Matthew chapter 27, verses 1 and 2, we're told that after the Sanhedrin had met with Christ, they had done an inquisition of Christ, so to speak, Jesus was taken before the political power. Matthew chapter 27, verses 1 and 2 says this, when morning came, all the chief priests and the elders, notice these are religious leaders of the people, plotted against Jesus to put him to death. And when they had bound him, they led him away and delivered him to Pontius Pilate, the governor. So in other words, they're saying as a church we cannot carry out our purposes, we cannot execute this troublemaker, so we need to appeal to the power of the state in order to execute our purposes, the death penalty against this man. Now it's interesting to notice that Jesus was accused of sedition against the Roman government. I don't know whether you've ever noticed that. But the Jews went before Pilate. They said, Pilate, this man said that he's a king. They knew very well that Jesus wasn't the kind of king that they wanted Pilate to think he was. But they said, this man says he's a king. And if he's a king, he's a rival of the emperor. He's a rival of Caesar. And so Jesus was accused of sedition, of causing an insurrection against the Roman government, even though Jesus had maintained a clear separation of church and state. In fact, in an interview that we find in John chapter 18 and verse 36, Jesus clearly expressed his view of the relationship that should exist between the church and the state. John chapter 18 and verse 36, we're told this. Jesus is speaking to Pilate. My kingdom is not of this world. If my kingdom were of this world, my servants would fight, so that I should not be delivered to the Jews. But now, my kingdom is not from here. Clearly, Jesus remained aloof from the government of his day. He said, I came to plant a spiritual kingdom. I came to build up my church upon the rock. I did not come to meddle or interfere with the political system. Very, very clearly, Jesus had it straight. And yet the Jews wanted to make it look like Jesus was a danger to the state, that he was a danger to Caesar's throne, and that the state therefore had to get rid of Christ because he might be a risk to the Roman government. Now, what epitomized the view of the Jews and the desires of the Jews was a man that is found in the title of our study this morning. His name was Barabbas. In Barabbas was gathered the desires of the Jews. He was actually representative of what the Jews, what the church of that day wanted. What did they want? What did Barabbas want? Actually, Barabbas wanted the church to take over the state and to establish a new order of things. In other words, he wanted the church to impose religious observances. He wanted the church to be a theocracy that governed the state. We're told in Mark chapter 15 and verse 7, and I'm reading from the King James Version, and there was one named Barabbas, which lay bound with them, and now notice, that had made insurrection with him, who had committed murder in the insurrection. That word insurrection means that there had been an attempt to overthrow the Roman government in that area. In other words, Barabbas was guilty of sedition against the Roman government, not Christ. Christ said, "My kingdom is not of this world." But Barabbas wanted to make the kingdom of God the kingdom of this world. Ellen White has an interesting statement about Barabbas. She gives several details in Desire of Ages, page 733. This is how it reads. The Roman authorities at this time held a prisoner named Barabbas, who was under sentence of death. This man had claimed to be the Messiah. He claimed, listen carefully, he claimed authority to establish a different order of things, to set the world right. A new order of things, to set the world right. And that would be by taking over the reins of the civil power. She continues saying, under satanic delusion, he claimed that whatever he could obtain by theft and robbery was his own. So he was a lawbreaker, he was a thief, and he was a murderer, according to this. He had done wonderful things through satanic agencies. He had gained a following among the people and had excited sedition against the Roman government under a cover of religious enthusiasm. Interesting.